Call them floating airports, mobile bases, or symbolic demonstrations of American power.
We're just a little bit crazy for wanting to do this. Taking off and landing on a moving runway that's only about 1,000 feet long in all kinds of weather and all kinds of seas. I think it just takes a special individual that wants to volunteer to go do that.
Aircraft carriers are the largest warships in the world, and their demonstration of air and sea power can be persuasive. These ships have been around since the 1920s, and like the way we fight wars today, a lot has changed. But as countries like China claim international waters as their own, how do carriers ensure the freedom of the seas? And how do they fit into tactics for future warfare? And as newer ships with newer technologies grow increasingly costly, how much are we willing to pay to hold our ground on the high seas? At 1,100 feet in length and 250 feet tall, the USS Gerald R. Ford is the latest aircraft carrier to be commissioned here in Norfolk.
The Ford has newer capabilities, updated modern capabilities that make it more efficient.
The Gerald R. Ford is the first of an entirely new class of aircraft carrier. At first glance, it may look like all other carriers, but some exclusive features put this ship in a class of its own. The Flight Command Center, called the Island, is smaller and moved toward the back of the ship. The Island also boasts an advanced radar system to better detect and respond to threats efficiently. Advanced arresting gear makes landing on the aircraft carrier easier and safer. And a big selling point for the Ford is an electromagnetic catapult system for aircraft, which launches planes in a similar way that roller coasters are powered. Every class of carrier includes 10 ships and is named after the first in its class, hence the Ford class. Before the Ford was the Nimitz class, America's first nuclear-powered class of carriers, first commissioned in 1975 with the USS Nimitz. Its 10th carrier was commissioned in 2009. We're here on top of the USS George H.W. Bush, the last of the Nimitz-class carriers. The ship sits not far from the Ford. Although the two are 8 years apart in age, some of the Bush's features, like a redesigned flight deck and a new radar tower, make the Bush appear more similar to the newer Ford-class carriers than the older Nimitz-class ones.
The idea was that before we go and build a whole new class of carrier, we want to test out some certain components on it to make sure that that's going to work.
Now, the USS George H.W. Bush will not be decommissioned until 2058, so it still has plenty of life left. The new Ford was commissioned in 2017, but it won't be ready to deploy until at least 2021. That's nearly twice as long as previous Nimitz-class carriers. Part of the reason for the delay are problems with the new catapult system.
We're a new system, and just like any new system, when you engineer it, right, you don't think about certain things that happen on the ship, like the weather or things like that. So we're going through growing pains that happen every time you design something new.
When President Trump visited the Ford last year, the electronic launching system, called EMALS, was still in its initial trials and had some glitches. That led the president to question whether the Navy shouldn't just go back to a steam catapult system altogether, like those used in Nimitz-class carriers. But the crew on the Ford insisted the new system would be ready for a new fleet of combat aircraft.
So F-35s is one of the reasons that we went into this new system, right? So the steam catapults are able to launch different aircraft. Us having EMALS gives us the opportunity to be able to launch any aircraft as long as we have a desired end speed that aircraft needs to reach.
The H.W. Bush is equipped with the older steam catapult system. The crew says the system works just fine.
That's a very large system to change, and I don't think that would be feasibly responsible to undergo that big of a change. Just because it's old doesn't mean it doesn't work.
It's a similar mindset of some members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, especially after hearing that the USS Gerald R. Ford's total upfront cost would be roughly double that of Nimitz-class carriers. In fact, back in 2016, when Congress authorized funds for future Navy ships, Senator John McCain, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, requested the Navy conduct a study of lower-cost alternatives to the supercarrier.
Reform is badly needed when we look at these outrageous and disgraceful cost overruns.
Dr. Bradley Martin is a retired Navy captain with the RAND Corporation. He created the report, Future Aircraft Carrier Options, for the committee.
Ford is an extraordinarily capable ship. At the same time, it's also extraordinarily expensive. They were hoping to see if there was some alternative that would do the job, but at less cost.
Dr. Martin's report offered 4 less expensive alternatives, everything from ditching some of the newer technologies to even reducing the size of the ships. The Navy criticized the 4 alternatives, telling Congress that they were ineffective for the missions and challenges it's facing today. But Dr. Martin countered that the Navy may not be seeing its own future clearly. For instance, how many aircraft will need to be launched, or sortied in naval terms, in a future conflict.
Sortie generation might not be quite the important thing we originally thought it was when the Ford was being developed. In fact, for the wars that we are likely to face in the future, that's not practical.
In the meantime, Nimitz-class carriers, ships without the technology the Navy says it needs, are preparing for future conflicts both at home and abroad. Here at Naval Base Yokosuka, the USS Ronald Reagan is the only aircraft carrier that's forward deployed here in Japan. Now, the naval base is shared between American and Japanese navies. The Reagan right now is undergoing a fast cruise, preparing itself for its next deployment.
3, 2, 1. We're checking to make sure that the people that are filling the different roles in the watch belt understand where they're going, who they're reporting to, how to work their equipment.
Being forward deployed means if the Reagan is not undergoing maintenance, it is always at sea. And since the Reagan is the only U.S. carrier in the Western Pacific, a region that includes the volatile South China Sea, the ship gets little downtime.
We are constantly in our operational area where we can have an immediate effect on any of our would-be adversaries. Also, everybody understands the strategic importance that this area of operation plays to the world economies and the strength and stability of the entire world because of what is at play and juxtapositions amongst all the countries here.
Last year, the Reagan completed joint training exercises in the South China Sea, joining the USS Carl Vinson, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and their strike groups in a show of force against Chinese territorial claims in the region. The Navy says the operation sent a peaceful message, though China saw it as provocation.
We are a weapon of war, right? That's why we exist. Our job is to put warheads on foreheads, as I will colloquially say. We train to the very best we can train to be as well prepared as we can in hopes that we never have to use it. That is the goal. We are so well trained, we are so well prepared that we become somebody you don't want to mess with.
America's show of force with its aircraft carriers is meant to reinforce freedom of the seas in the area. It's something the Navy has been doing for years.
This was in the spring of 1996. There was some we'll call it a little kerfuffle over in the South China Sea. In order to support our national interests and those of our allies, Taiwan at this point, pulled the aircraft carrier out of the Arabian Gulf, and a week later we were sitting in the South China Sea. That story alone shows you how important aircraft carriers are, right?
So important that Navy officials will say aircraft carriers have been the national force of choice ever since World War II. And in more than 80% of the times when the world was faced with international violence, the United States has responded with at least one carrier strike group. We're about 100 miles southwest of San Diego in the Pacific Ocean. On top of the USS John C. Stennis, this carrier is training for its next deployment.
It's a dangerous job. We're talking about aircraft going 150 miles an hour, so 135 knots, stopping at about 250 feet. 0 to 160 knots off the bow to 2.5 seconds. That is incredibly dangerous, but it's incredibly challenging and it's hard.
The Stennis is a Nimitz-class carrier that just welcomed its air wing aboard, a key step in assembling a carrier strike group. Led by Admiral Michael Wetlaufer, a strike group is composed of the carrier, escort ships, an air wing, and a full crew.
In this training phase, a really important part is to make sure that the synchronization of all the things that have to work together is actually happening. I think we're always looking to send a message to our partners, allies, and reassure them that we can operate together and we're going to, protect the global commons. For a seagoing nation, our economic vibrancy is certainly built on trade, and so one of the things the Navy does is reassure ourselves, the United States, the public, that we are going to be able to have free and open trade in the global commons and access to the same.
The strike group sends that message through its presence on the seas, visiting ports throughout the region, and conducting training exercises with allied forces. It can be a delicate move, especially as China grows its own fleet, commissioning its second aircraft carrier in 2017 and reportedly building a third. On the Stennis, Captain Greg Huffman remains confident in the capabilities of older Nimitz-class carriers, especially of his own 23-year-old ship.
These carriers are very, very resilient. We have the ability to upgrade things as we go. So we're always adding new technology to them, and we're very good at what we do.
Nimitz-class carriers go through routine refurbishments and upgrades following each deployment, and are able to repair some of its systems at sea, including the wires that trap planes upon landing and the steam-powered catapults used to launch aircraft.
Sortie generation rate by a steam catapult averages 1 minute, but when timed right and utilizing the entire flight deck, you can launch 4 aircraft in that same 60 seconds.
If you can generate sorties faster and recover them faster, that's always going to be a good thing.
But other than hardware, all of these warships have another challenge: to keep its budding crew, its sailors and pilots, combat ready in a place they will call home for months at a time.
It's a very humbling thing for me to walk around and see a 19 or 20-year-old sailor that a year and a half, 2 years ago, were trying to get through high school algebra, are out here now keeping a $60+ million aircraft airborne with a pilot in it that's loaded.
It all comes down to training, something they say is crucial on an aging ship.
You can have the most whiz-bang machine out there, and if you don't have the right people operating it, you're not going to be successful. I've got stories from years gone by flying really old aircraft. We're able to conduct a mission that much newer aircraft were struggling to do because of the mindset we instilled in the sailors to actually step up and take that pride and ownership.
While Nimitz-class carriers and their crews prepare at sea, the USS Gerald R. Ford continues to undergo trials and training back in Norfolk. And with 2 more Ford-class carriers on the way, the Navy insists that these are the ships capable of coping with the challenges of a fast-growing and aggressive Chinese Navy in the Pacific. But this shift includes an increased reliance on automation and technology over old-fashioned naval manpower. A hefty and costly bet that this new class of carriers will give the U.S. the upper hand for years to come. For USA Today, I'm Kevin Schmidt.